Hi guys, and welcome back to the early bird photo news from Cairns this week. No noisy lorikeets, but you might hear a little bit of rain behind me. Hope that's not too distracting. The road trip has been going well and we finally made it to Cairns, where we're going to stay for a little while. After leaving Townsville last week, we stayed at a few different spots, but one spot in particular really stood out to me. It's right at the beach and there's these amazing southern cassowaries that sometimes wander out from the rainforest and onto the beach, where you can actually get nice and clean shots of them. The only problem was the weather behind me, because the 2 days we were there is just pouring down non-stop, more than 100 mil of rain. So it was very wet, but I'm actually not going to be stopped by a little bit of rain if there's some amazing birds out there. And so I toughed it out, put the camera under my t-shirt, walked up and down the beach until I found a few of the birds. I actually got some nice shots, and with these uptight sort of closed up shots, the rain actually had a pretty cool effect, especially when shooting against a darker background. It almost looked like kind of stars behind the cassowary on the dark background. My lens and camera got very wet, but this is why I pay the big bucks for this expensive equipment, because I expect it to work even in heavy rain. And it did. I had a little bit of condensation inside the EVF on the next morning of the R5, but all in all, that's gone now and the camera performed very well. I'm very happy with the photos and some videos that I got off the Cassowaries. And if you're a photographer and want to learn all about image editing and edit the images like this cassowary, for instance, I would highly recommend that you check out my Pro sets, where with just one click you can get your raw files to a great starting point. And then check out my masterclass, where I teach you step by step all the necessary things you need to know in Photoshop to make your own images look great. So if this is of interest to you, make sure to check that out down there in the description. Here in Cairns, the rain has unfortunately continued for a little bit. We had about 5 days and only 2 days had decent weather, and the other days had pretty much continuous pouring rain. The only good thing is that after a logistic struggle, I was finally able to put my hands on my very own R7. Because it's actually not that easy to take delivery of a camera if you're traveling on the road and usually only staying 1 or 2 nights in a place. So the camera arrived yesterday, actually while I was filming the bird photography show, so there was a slight interruption there. And then I was able to set it up last night. I gone through all the menu items, set them all up to the way I like it. The first thing you notice when you pick up the R7 is that it's a lot smaller and lighter than like an R6 or an R5, for instance. And my pinky doesn't really know where to go. It's kind of dangling below the camera because my hands are quite large and this camera feels slightly small to me. And because there's no battery grip available, this might be a little bit of a challenge to hold sometimes. And on bigger lenses, or even a lens like the 100-500, it feels slightly unbalanced because the lens is heavier than the camera, so it always kind of leans forward. But all in all, I'm relatively happy with the body. It has a decent size and a decent weight, so all in all, quite good. Normally, no one likes a third wheel, but in this case, I would have really liked a third wheel. I can actually live with the wheel up here. That's in quite an ergonomic position and your thumb can easily wheel it, and the joystick in the middle works okay for me. But what I'm really not liking at all is this silly sort of 4-way switch down here. If that was a wheel, I would have had no complaints at all about the camera, because at the moment it's actually quite difficult to change your ISO. You have to press at least one button and then turn a wheel to change the ISO, and that makes it a lot more difficult for me to use the camera in the field. So if I had a third wheel where I can just wheel to change the ISO without having to press another button, that would have dramatically improved how I use the camera in the field. So maybe I could program it to the control ring of the lens, but for instance on the 100-500, the control ring is so far back close to the camera body that it's almost impossible to hold the lens if you're using that ring. So that's also not a great solution. But enough about the complaining, because there's a lot to like about this camera as well. What I like about the camera, for instance, is this on-off video switch. That seems to work quite well, and it also has custom photo and custom video functions. So that's another great addition. Let's talk about one of the big elephants in the room, and that's the buffer. And if you're using an electronic shutter 30 frames per second, you hit the buffer in no time. You press the button, you hit the buffer. So you have to be a little bit conscious of that in the field and kind of do smaller bursts or slow down your frame rate. I've also set the camera to C-RAW because that gives me an additional few frames in the buffer to also be able to shoot a little bit longer. While it's workable, it would definitely be nice if it was much bigger. So if you don't want to use the electronic shutter mode because you might have a bit of rolling shutter, or you feel like your buffer is filling up too quickly and you use the mechanical shutter mode, you will run into another problem. Let me show you. And that's this loud shutter sound. And this is something that I definitely don't enjoy. It's not the worst shutter sound I've ever heard. I think it's not as loud as a 1DX series camera, but it's definitely not very pleasant to listen to. So that's my very first impressions from today, the first day of using the camera. Obviously, I'm going to use it much more in the field. I'm going to put it through its paces. It's going to be dark pretty much the whole time, so I'm going to have to use a lot of high ISO, and I'm going to make a proper review and share all my experiences from the field with you. But I would also like to hear from you guys who already have an R7. How are you liking the camera? Are you liking the shutter sound? Are you using the electronic shutter or the mechanical shutter? What do you think about the buffer? Make sure to let me know in the comments. As of late, it has been pretty quiet when it comes to camera use, but one genre has been getting a lot of attention, and I don't know if there's anyone that's actually excited about this genre, and that's vlogging cameras. Sony already has a few cameras in that segment, for instance the ZV-E10, and now Nikon launched a dedicated vlogging camera with 20 megapixels, no EVF, the Z30 as well. And there's another rumor that Canon will actually this year also release a vlogging style camera similar to those two cameras. So I actually didn't think this was such a big market, cameras with no EVF at a decent price point dedicated for vlogging. Is this something that you guys are interested in or know people using this camera? Make sure to let me know in the comments. Because for me as a hybrid shooter, I always struggle with cameras that don't have an EVF because I don't want to take photos like this. Maybe I'm just old and the younger smartphone generation is used to holding their camera kind of in front of their face looking at the rear screen rather than an EVF, but I always feel like if I want to take half decent photos, I definitely need a viewfinder, and then I would prefer a smaller camera that's more of a real hybrid rather than a vlogging camera that is mainly for video and can take some photos. But since all the companies are fighting for this segment and releasing a lot of cameras, there must be a lot of people buying these cameras, and maybe people prefer a small vlogging camera that does better 4K over using their phone for like TikToks, for instance. I'm not sure. If you know, let me know in the comments. There's also been another rumor that's almost confirmed that Canon will bring out an R7C, a cinema version of the R7 next year. So very small, compact cinema camera that apparently can shoot up to 7K 60 frames per second. Personally, I'm not super interested in the cinema cameras because an R5 has some advantages over an R5C for me, for instance, but it's definitely interesting for many people, I think, because it would be a very small and lightweight option. So if you just want to have a small backup camera or want to be really low key somewhere in a busy location, a small R7C with a small lens could be a nice handholdable setup for sure. I've also been watching a lot more videos about the Nikon 4.5 400mm lens. Do you know anyone who bought one or is using one? Let me know in the comments because I'd be really interested to see who's actually buying that lens. Because I think even after watching all these videos, this lens still has not so much appeal for nature or especially bird photographers. Maybe if you're shooting bigger mammals in a place like Africa, this lens could work well for you, but for most bird photographers, I think this lens is not super interesting. However, thinking about it more, I was thinking if it works very well with the 1.4 extender and actually better than the 5.6 500mm lens, this lens could become interesting because with the 1.4 extender, it will become an f6.3 500mm lens that's lightweight and at a very similar price point to the very popular 5.6 500mm lens. So maybe this is where Nikon was going with it, and if the lens works well with the 1.4 extender, it could be kind of the Z-mount replacement for the beloved 5.6 500mm lens. If you currently own a 5.6 500mm lens, are you at all interested in that new lens and maybe using it with the 1.4 extender, or are you sticking with your 500mm lens? Because from what I've seen, I think Mark Smith was doing a review, the Z-mount 100 to 400 in terms of autofocus, for instance, outperformed the 5.6 500mm lens, so having a native Z-mount lens definitely seems to have advantages at times. I would also love to talk more about Sony, but their gear, cameras and lenses must already be perfect since there haven't been any rumors and not much new gear released at all. So if you're a Sony shooter, is your gear perfect? Let me know in the comments. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this week's early bird photo news. I was going to grab my R7 100 to 500mm lens now and head out, but it's still raining a lot, so I'm not sure if I'm going to get any shots today, but hopefully over the next few days and weeks I will be able to get a lot more shots with this setup and we'll be able to share them with all of you in a proper review. Until then, please make sure to give me a thumbs up for this video, let me know your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel down there, and I will see you in the next video very soon. Bye guys.